I first heard of this story back in the spring of this year, 2023, and I didn't really act on it or do much about it because it's about horses, and I'm basically a dog and cat veterinarian. I don't work with horses. But it came up again last week. It was in a 60 Minutes Newsmagazine article that aired November 12th, 2023. And the way they presented the information makes me feel like I need to come here and explain to you how they just misdirected and completely missed the point on this story. Okay, so here's the article on 60 Minutes. You can click on it. I'll put a link in the description. But if you watch it closely and pay attention, they start out talking about this sudden, unexplained increase in fatal racehorse injuries in the spring of 23. You may remember it being in the news. A lot of horses were breaking their legs and other injuries and having to be euthanized. And it was a lot of new injuries at once. It was very out of the ordinary. And they couldn't find anything to blame it on. They couldn't figure out what was wrong. Well, if you watch this 60 Minutes news article, they then transition to talking about corruption and doping and all the stuff that's wrong with horse racing, which is true. It's terrible. But that hasn't changed. That stuff's been going on for decades and decades, or 100 years, or as long as there's been competitive sports and million-dollar athletes, whether they're racehorses or baseball players or Tour de France cyclists. As long as there have been million-dollar athletes, human nature is to lie, cheat, steal, do whatever you can do to get a competitive advantage to make more money, whether it's fame or fortune. That's what happens. Okay. So that hasn't changed. That's been going on 100 years. That didn't suddenly get worse in the spring of this year. Um, and you may want to blame the veterinarians and the trainers and everybody who's doing the doping and the corruption. And yes, it's a bad thing. I'm definitely not defending that. Just saying it hasn't changed. And I'll also say briefly, which is not the point I'm trying to make here, where do those drugs come from in the first place? If Big Pharma wasn't making those drugs, that would solve a lot of the problem with drug misuse in horse racing and other competitive sports. Okay. So the 60 Minutes article and the head of the Horse Racing Safety Commission, the veterinarian there, they have no idea what's changed or what's caused this increase in injuries. But it's right there in plain sight. Here it is. They started using this new GPS electronic monitoring measuring device in horses in the spring of this year. This monitoring device, they don't really understand that it disrupts the horse's neurologic system enough that it's causing these injuries. So horses are very, very sensitive to neurologic changes and electromagnetic radiation changes and anything in their environment. Anything that goes wrong in a horse's environment, the horses are sensitive and they're sick and it's a disaster. People and dogs aren't quite as sensitive, or at least most of us aren't. Some people and dogs are really sensitive to these things, but the majority of us aren't, whereas in horses, they're all super sensitive. So this measuring device, it interferes with the horse's neurologic system and their nerves enough that maybe one muscle will just misfire by a few microseconds. I mean, something that we would never see or notice. But look at the size of a horse's muscles, okay? They've got the same muscles we have, lots of shoulder and arm muscles that are way bigger than ours. Their quadriceps, their hamstrings, their glutes, their thighs. I mean, they're massive. If you get kicked by a horse, you die. If you get kicked by a horse, the pressure and the impact is so much that your heart and your aorta rip from their attachments and you bleed to death within seconds. And that's not even counting, the crushing, breaking bones of all your chest. I mean, horses are big and powerful is the point. Their muscles are big and powerful. So if one of those multiple muscles around the shoulder or the back leg fires at the wrong time, those muscles are so big and powerful that they'll break the bone in the leg. Or they'll rip away from their attachment on the bone, which is almost impossible to reattach. And those horses have to be put down or euthanized. They can't be fixed. So that's what's happening. And it says even right here on the Stride Safe devices on their own page, they brag about this study they implemented at Churchill Downs in the spring of 2023, where this measuring device is measuring GPS and motion and monitoring and all these things in horses. They're measuring it to try to figure out what's going wrong before a horse gets injured. Okay, they have a point of doing it. They just don't realize that it's disrupting the horse's neurologic system, causing more problems. This device collects data at more than 2,400 times per second. Okay, so that's hard for us to understand how fast that is. I can't really understand it. For comparison, a race car engine turning 10,000 RPMs is 14 times slower than this data collection. So data collection at 24 times per second is 14 times faster than a race car engine turning 10,000 RPMs. It's that many more times per second. So I don't even know how to like understand that. But their website, if you look at their website that I put up here, It's all about the science of the device and trying to determine what happens to a horse leading up to an injury, like I said. But nowhere does anyone at this company or the veterinarians or the safety commission, nowhere does anyone talk about how this technology and EMFs and GPS affects the horse's neurologic system and causes injury. And it's obvious. They started using this device at Churchill Downs in the spring of this year. And in the spring of this year, a bunch of horses started breaking their legs and getting euthanized way more than average. The 60 Minutes article says, well, doping is a problem. Well, doping is a problem, no doubt. But that's been going on 100 years. That didn't change this spring. Okay, so a little bit more information about this, a little bit better explanation. It's still pretty short to read, is on this website by Arthur Furstenberg. And he has, that's just one article on his site, but here's the rest of his site, cellphonetaskforce.org. It's about how radio waves and microwaves and radiation and Wi-Fi and cell phones and just everything in our environment affects our living cells, not just our neurology, not just the nerve function in horses, but all of our living cells. So it's really good information. If you don't know about that, you should look into it. Thanks.